What's up, everybody? It's Miles here from bootcamp.com, and today in pulmonology, we're going to be covering pulmonary vascular resistance. All right, so when we're discussing pulmonary vascular resistance, there's one concept that you first need to understand, and it's super high yield, and they love to test this on board exams. And it's that blood vessels near the lungs specifically act differently than blood vessels near any other organ in the body. So for the blood vessels that are near every other organ in the body, their primary concern is delivering oxygen to that organ. So if for some reason that organ is hypoxic or they have low levels of oxygen, the blood vessels are going to say, okay, we're going to vasodilate because that's going to increase blood flow to that organ, and that's going to in turn deliver more oxygen to that organ. And in contrast to this, the blood vessels near the lungs actually have two concerns. They need to deliver and get rid of their CO2, and secondly, they need to extract oxygen out of the alveoli. And so when these blood vessels near the lungs encounter an alveoli that has very low oxygen levels, these blood vessels are going to think, well, the only reason that this alveoli has low oxygen levels is because it's probably a very poorly ventilated alveoli. So A, this alveoli probably won't be able to accept very much of my CO2 and exhale it properly into the environment. And B, I probably won't be able to extract very much oxygen out of this poorly ventilated alveoli. And so what the pulmonary vessels are going to do around alveoli that have low oxygen levels is they're going to vasoconstrict, because this is going to limit blood flow to those alveoli, and it's going to divert blood flow to alveoli that have higher oxygen levels, that are better ventilated, and so they can better dispense of their CO2 into the alveoli and extract the proper amount of oxygen. And so this phenomenon is called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. And like we just said, this is where blood vessels near hypoxic alveoli will vasoconstrict, which again is completely opposite from everywhere else in the body where blood vessels will vasodilate when they encounter a hypoxic organ in order to increase blood flow and oxygen delivery to that organ. All right, so not only is hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction high yield in itself, but it also has a very high yield tie-in when we start to talk about fetal circulation. So recall that during fetal development, the fetal lungs are actually filled with amniotic fluid. And as a result, they're very hypoxic. And because the fetal alveoli are hypoxic, that means the pulmonary vessels during fetal development are going to undergo vasoconstriction. And because all of these pulmonary vessels here are going to be vasoconstricted, that means blood is going to have a very hard time getting through those constricted vessels. The resistance is going to be very high. And as a result, blood is going to back up behind the pulmonary vessels, and it's going to build up in pressure. And specifically, the structures that we want to be focusing on here that are going to have very high pressure is going to be the pulmonary artery, the right ventricle, and the right atrium. And we can see that on our diagram here. We're going to have high pressure in the pulmonary artery, in the right ventricle, and in the right atrium. And so there are two important shunts that exist in the fetal circulation that we want to consider for this discussion. The first is called the foramen ovale, and the second is called the ductus arteriosus. And so the foramen ovale is a hole that exists between the right atrium and the left atrium. It exists in fetal development. And because the right atrial pressures are so high during fetal development, the blood from the right atrium can flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle, but it can also flow through that foramen ovale into the left atrium and enter the systemic circulation. And this foramen ovale is going to close shortly after birth. And so furthermore, the ductus arteriosus is a channel or a tube that connects the pulmonary artery and the aorta. And again, this pretty much only exists in fetal development and will close shortly after birth. And because the pressures are so high in the pulmonary artery during fetal development, the blood is going to flow from the pulmonary artery through the ductus arteriosus and again enter the systemic circulation. And so just one more time, Because of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction during fetal development, the pressures in the pulmonary artery, the right ventricle, and the right atrium are going to be very high. Because pressures are very high in the pulmonary artery, blood is going to flow from the pulmonary artery into the aorta through the ductus arteriosus. We call it the patent ductus arteriosus when it's open. And this is an example of a right to left shunt because blood from the right side of the heart is entering the left-sided circulation. And because pressures are high in the right atrium, then blood is going to flow from the right atrium to the left atrium through the foramen ovale, and again, this would also be considered a right to left shunt. All right, now this is where it gets very high yield. So when the baby is born and it takes its first breath, so during the baby's first breath, all of that air is going to rush into the lungs and start to displace all of that amniotic fluid. And as a result of there being oxygen now present in the lungs, the pulmonary vessels are going to start to vasodilate. And because of this vasodilation, there is going to be decreased resistance in the pulmonary circulation. And so not only am I going to highlight it, but I'm going to underline it and I'm going to star it because this is seriously high yield. It's on every exam. There's going to be decreased resistance in the pulmonary circulation after the baby's first breath because those pulmonary vessels are vasodilating after the introduction of oxygen. And so because that resistance falls, now the blood is going to be able to move through the pulmonary circulation and blood won't be backed up behind the pulmonary vessels anymore. And so the pressures are going to drop in the pulmonary artery, they're going to drop in the right ventricle, and they're going to drop in the right atrium. And so as a result of these pressure drops, now the aortic pressure is going to be higher than the pulmonary artery pressure, and the left atrial pressure is going to be higher than the right atrial pressure. And so blood is going to reverse its direction of flow through these shunts. So now through the ductus arteriosus, blood is going to be going from the aorta into the pulmonary artery. And through the foramen ovale, blood is now going to be going from the left atrium to the right atrium. So blood reverses its direction through the shunts of the ductus arteriosus and the foramen ovale. And once it starts to reverse its direction of flow, the shunts are going to quickly close. And so if we just look at our diagram here of the newborn heart, the ductus arteriosus is going to be closed and the foramen ovale is going to be closed when the blood starts to reverse its direction through those shunts. All right, and that's all we got for our video on pulmonary vascular resistance.